The moment a powerful man refuses to look at someone, he may be turning his back on the very truth that could change his life. The chandeliers of the Ashford Grand cast warm golden light across polished marble floors as the city's elite filled the restaurant with the quiet hum of expensive conversations. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Silverware gleamed beneath the glow. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath a cold November sky. Inside, every table seemed occupied by people who measured success in stock prices, private jets, and names that appeared on the covers of business magazines. Emily Carter moved between the tables with practiced grace. Her black uniform was simple. Her hair was pulled back neatly. Her smile was professional but never forced. Most customers barely noticed her. She had spent years becoming invisible to people who only looked at titles and bank accounts. Yet there was something different about her. Something calm. Something steady. While other servers rushed, Emily seemed to glide through the room, carrying trays, refilling glasses, and remembering details that made guests feel cared for without ever realizing why. The dinner rush had just reached its peak when the front doors opened. A sudden hush spread through part of the dining room. Several guests glanced toward the entrance. A few whispered to each other. Jonathan Hayes had arrived. At 42, Jonathan was one of the most recognizable billionaires in America. Founder of Hayes Global Holdings. Featured on magazine covers. Invited to private meetings with senators and CEOs. The kind of man whose signature could change a company's future overnight. He stepped inside wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a silver watch that probably cost more than some people earned in a year. His expression remained neutral as he crossed the dining room. Confident. Controlled. Used to being noticed. The restaurant manager hurried forward. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes. Your table is ready." Jonathan gave a brief nod. His eyes swept the room once, then stopped. Emily had just reached table 14 with a coffee refill. The manager followed his gaze. "Emily will be taking care of your table tonight. She's one of our best." Something shifted in Jonathan's face. Not anger. Not exactly. More like immediate rejection. Cold. Instant. Final. "No," he said. The manager blinked. "Sir." Jonathan adjusted his cufflink. "Get someone else." Nearby conversations seemed to fade. "I'm sorry," the manager asked carefully. Jonathan's eyes never left Emily. "I said I don't want her serving me." Silence spread across the immediate area. Emily heard every word. So did two nearby servers. So did the couple seated closest to the entrance. Yet she didn't react. She simply set down the coffee pot, smiled politely at her guests, and finished her table service as if nothing had happened. The manager looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Hayes, Emily is one of our most experienced. Someone else." Jonathan's tone remained calm. "That's my preference." Emily finally turned. Their eyes met for the first time. She expected arrogance. Instead, she saw something stranger. Recognition. Not complete recognition. More like a shadow of it. A feeling Jonathan himself didn't seem to understand. Emily offered a small professional smile. "Of course, sir." Then she walked away. No argument. No embarrassment. No visible frustration. Just quiet dignity. Somehow that made Jonathan even more uncomfortable. He watched her disappear toward the service station. Something about her felt familiar. Not her face. Not her voice. Something else. But before he could place it, a business associate slid into the seat across from him, and the evening continued. Orders were taken. Wine was poured. Conversations resumed. Yet Jonathan found his attention drifting across the room again and again. Each time he looked, Emily was helping someone. An elderly couple. A young family celebrating a birthday. A nervous man preparing for what looked like a proposal. She treated every person exactly the same. Near the end of the hour, Jonathan reached for his water glass. That was when he heard the manager's voice from across the dining room. "Emily Carter," he called. "When you finish table 16, I need you in my office for a minute." The glass froze halfway to Jonathan's lips. His eyes lifted instantly. The color drained from his face. Around him, nobody noticed. Nobody except Emily, who paused briefly before turning toward the manager. "Yes, sir," she replied. Jonathan stared at her. Not because of her face. Not because she was a waitress. But because of the name he had just heard. Carter. Emily Carter. And suddenly, 25 years of buried memories began clawing their way back into the light. Jonathan Hayes had spent most of his life believing that the past could be managed the same way he managed companies. File it away. Lock it behind a polished door. Focus on what was ahead. Yet as he sat beneath the soft glow of the restaurant lights, one name had shattered 25 years of careful distance. Carter. The name echoed through his mind long after the manager disappeared into his office. His business associate continued discussing a merger worth hundreds of millions of dollars, but Jonathan barely heard a word. Numbers had always been easy for him. Memories were not. Across the restaurant, Emily moved from table to table as if nothing unusual had happened. She carried plates, refilled glasses, smiled politely at guests. To everyone else, she looked like an ordinary waitress finishing another busy shift. Jonathan watched her more carefully now. There was something about the way she carried herself. No rush, no resentment, no attempt to impress anyone. The confidence did not come from status. It came from knowing exactly who she was. That realization unsettled him, because 25 years earlier, there had been another Carter who carried himself the same way. A man who never cared about titles. A man who seemed completely unaffected by wealth or power. Jonathan suddenly remembered a summer afternoon in Connecticut. He had been 17, angry at the world, angry at his father, angry at expectations that felt heavier than the family name itself. Michael Carter had worked on the Hayes estate then. Officially, he managed maintenance and property operations. Unofficially, he seemed capable of fixing anything. Broken equipment, broken schedules, sometimes even broken people. Jonathan remembered sitting alone near the lake behind the estate after a humiliating argument with his father. Michael had found him there. The older man had not offered advice. He had not lectured. He had simply sat beside him in silence for nearly an hour. When he finally spoke, it was only one sentence. The strongest people I know are the ones who do not need everyone else to know they are strong. At the time, Jonathan had dismissed it. Years later, he still remembered every word. A glass touched the table, pulling him back to the present. Another server had arrived with fresh water. Jonathan glanced toward Emily again. She was speaking with an elderly woman near the window. The woman smiled warmly and squeezed Emily's hand before she walked away. Jonathan looked away first. Something felt wrong. Not with Emily. With him. He had refused her service without knowing a single thing about her. The realization sat heavily in his chest. Meanwhile, Emily entered the manager's office. The small room overlooked the kitchen through a narrow window. "Everything okay?" she asked. The manager smiled. "More than okay. I wanted to tell you personally. We received another 5-star review this morning. The customer specifically mentioned you by name." Emily laughed softly. "That is nice to hear. You have become one of the reasons people come back." He handed her a printed copy of the review. Emily glanced at it briefly before folding it and placing it inside her apron pocket. "Thank you. Most people would frame that." Emily smiled. "Most people are smarter than me." "No," the manager said. "Most people need recognition. You never seem to." For a moment, her expression changed. Just slightly. "Recognition is nice," she said quietly, "but it is not the same thing as peace." The manager nodded, although he clearly did not fully understand. Few people did. Emily left the office and returned to the dining room. As she crossed between tables, the silver key hanging from a thin chain beneath her uniform briefly slipped into view. Only for a second. A small antique key, worn smooth with age. Emily quickly tucked it back beneath her collar. But Jonathan had seen it. His heartbeat stopped. The memory arrived instantly. A matching silver key. Identical shape. Identical engraving. He had seen one before. Not in a photograph. Not in a museum. In his father's study. Hidden inside a locked wooden box that had not been opened in decades. Jonathan slowly stood from his chair. Across the room, Emily disappeared through the kitchen doors. For the first time that evening, the billionaire no longer cared about the business deal sitting in front of him. Because the mystery had suddenly become much larger than a name. And somewhere deep inside, he could not shake the feeling that Emily Carter had just unknowingly stepped into a story that his family had spent 25 years trying to forget. Jonathan Hayes left the Ashford Grand nearly an hour later, but his mind never left the restaurant. The city lights blurred beyond the tinted windows of his car as Manhattan drifted past in silver reflections and endless motion. Normally, he used the ride home to review reports, approve proposals, or answer messages from executives scattered across 3 continents. Tonight, his tablet remained untouched beside him. All he could think about was a name and a key. Carter. The driver pulled up to Jonathan's penthouse overlooking Central Park. The elevator carried him silently to the top floor. Minutes later, he crossed a hallway lined with modern artwork worth millions and entered a private study few people had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling shelves surrounded the room. Leather-bound books, historical documents, family records, pieces of the past that Jonathan rarely revisited. Yet tonight he walked directly toward a cabinet hidden behind a sliding panel. He unlocked it using a biometric scanner. Inside sat a small wooden box. Simple, unremarkable, older than anything else in the room. Jonathan stared at it for several seconds before lifting the lid. There it was, a silver key. The metal had darkened with age, but the design remained unmistakable. The same curved handle, the same engraving near the base, the same shape he had seen hanging around Emily Carter's neck. His pulse quickened. 25 years ago, his father had told him only one thing about the key. If you ever find the matching one, you will finally understand what happened. Jonathan had been 17, too impatient to ask questions, too focused on proving himself. Over the years, he had almost forgotten the conversation. Now every word returned with perfect clarity. He carefully removed the key and turned it beneath the desk lamp. The engraving caught the light. Two intertwined initials, H and C, Hayes and Carter. Jonathan sat down slowly. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. Not of his father, of Michael Carter. It was late evening on the estate. The older man had been repairing an antique lock inside a storage building that no longer existed. Jonathan remembered asking why he cared so much about old things. Michael had smiled. Because some things are valuable long before people realize it. At the time, Jonathan thought they were discussing locks. Now he was not so sure. Across the city, Emily finally finished her shift. The restaurant had emptied. Chairs were being stacked. The kitchen lights dimmed one section at a time. She changed out of her uniform and stepped into the cold November air. A light breeze carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby street vendor. She wrapped her coat tighter and began walking toward her apartment. Unlike Jonathan's world of penthouses and private elevators, Emily lived in a modest brick building on the Upper West Side. Nothing luxurious, nothing impressive, yet every room felt warm. Lived in, earned. She climbed 3 flights of stairs and unlocked her door. The first thing she did was check a framed photograph resting on a small bookshelf. A man stood smiling beside a younger version of herself. Michael Carter, her father. Emily touched the frame gently. It had become a nightly ritual, not out of sadness, out of gratitude. The lessons he left behind seemed more valuable with every passing year. As she moved through the apartment preparing tea, the silver key slipped from beneath her sweater once again. This time she paused and held it in her palm. The metal felt cool against her skin. She had worn it almost every day since she was 12 years old. Her father had given it to her shortly before he passed away. "Protect this," he had said. "One day it will answer questions neither of us can answer right now." Emily smiled softly. She had always assumed it was simply one of his mysteries, one of the many unfinished stories life leaves behind. She returned the key beneath her collar and carried her tea to the window. Far below, traffic flowed through the city like rivers of light. She had no idea that only a few miles away, another matching key rested on a billionaire's desk. And she certainly did not know that before sunrise, Jonathan Hayes would hire the most discreet investigative firm in New York to uncover everything they could find about Emily Carter, her family, and the secret Michael Carter had carried to his grave. The report arrived at Jonathan Hayes' office at exactly 7:23 the next morning. He had already been awake for nearly 2 hours. A cup of untouched coffee sat beside his desk as dawn painted the skyline in pale shades of silver and blue. Jonathan opened the secure file expecting answers. Instead, the first page raised even more questions. Emily Carter, age 29. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No scandals. No social media obsession. No signs of someone chasing attention or influence. Her employment history was remarkably ordinary. Restaurants, cafes, hospitality work. Yet Jonathan quickly noticed a pattern. Every employer described her almost exactly the same way. Reliable, honest, calm under pressure, respected by coworkers, trusted by customers. He continued reading. Then he stopped. His eyes narrowed. Michael Carter had not always been a maintenance manager. According to archived records, he had once worked directly for Jonathan's grandfather. Not as an employee, as a trusted advisor. Jonathan leaned back slowly. That made no sense. His grandfather had surrounded himself with lawyers, executives, and financial experts. Why would someone like Michael Carter hold such a position? Jonathan turned the page. A photograph appeared. It had been taken nearly 30 years earlier. Several men stood outside a countryside estate. One of them was Jonathan's grandfather. Another was Michael Carter. The two men stood side by side, smiling, looking less like employer and employee and more like partners. Jonathan felt a chill move through him. He immediately pressed a button on his desk phone. "Give me everything on Michael Carter," he said. "Everything means everything." "Yes, sir." Across the city, Emily's morning looked very different. She sat at a small neighborhood bakery near her apartment, grading assignments for a literacy program where she volunteered twice a week. The children ranged from 8 to 12 years old. Some struggled with reading. Others simply needed encouragement. Emily loved the work. She always had. The owner placed a fresh blueberry muffin beside her. "On the house," he said. Emily laughed softly. "You keep saying that. And you keep helping my grandson with reading. He is doing all the hard work." The owner smiled. "That sounds exactly like something your father would have said." Emily's expression softened. People still remembered Michael Carter. Not because he had been wealthy. Not because he had been famous. But because he had shown up when people needed help. She folded the assignments and slipped them into her bag. As she stood, the silver key briefly appeared beneath her sweater again. The bakery owner noticed it. "Still wearing it?" Emily nodded. "Every day. You ever figure out what it opens?" "Not yet." He smiled. "Maybe some mysteries need time." Emily smiled back. She had heard that sentence before. Her father used to say something similar. What she did not know was that at that very moment, Jonathan Hayes was staring at an enlarged photograph of an old ledger recovered from family archives. A handwritten note appeared in the margin beside Michael Carter's name. The ink had faded, but the words remained readable. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten as he read them. "Trusted keeper. Secondary key holder. Access granted." Jonathan stood so quickly that his chair rolled backward. Secondary key holder. The phrase echoed in his mind. There had been two keys. Not one. Two. His gaze drifted toward the silver key resting on his desk. Suddenly the pieces began aligning into a shape he did not yet understand. If Michael Carter had been trusted with the second key, then Emily had not inherited an ordinary family keepsake. She had inherited part of a secret. Jonathan moved to the window overlooking Manhattan. Thousands of people crossed the city below, unaware that hidden beneath decades of silence was a mystery connecting one of the wealthiest families in America to a waitress who had never asked for anyone's attention. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Hayes found himself chasing something more important than money. He was chasing the truth. 3 days passed before Jonathan Hayes made a decision he could not explain to anyone, including himself. He returned to the Ashford Grand. Not for a business dinner. Not for a meeting. Not for publicity. He arrived alone. The restaurant manager recognized him immediately and hurried forward with the same careful smile. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes." Jonathan glanced around the dining room. "Is Emily working tonight?" The question surprised even him. The manager hesitated for half a second. "She starts in about 10 minutes. Jonathan nodded and requested a table near the back of the restaurant. Far from the center. Far from attention. As he sat down, he found himself watching the entrance more than the menu. Exactly 11 minutes later, Emily stepped inside carrying a canvas tote bag and wearing a simple navy coat. She greeted the hostess, smiled at the bartenders, asked a server about his daughter who had recently been sick. Every interaction seemed effortless, genuine. Jonathan noticed something unusual. People relaxed around her. The effect was subtle but impossible to miss. She made others feel seen. The manager approached Emily and quietly pointed toward Jonathan's table. Emily glanced across the room. Their eyes met briefly. There was no surprise in her expression. No excitement. No nervousness. Just calm professionalism. A few moments later she approached. "Good evening, sir." Jonathan stood automatically. The gesture surprised both of them. "Good evening, Emily." For a second neither spoke. Jonathan suddenly remembered the way he had dismissed her only days earlier. The memory felt embarrassing now. Emily saved him from the silence. "Would you like sparkling water or still?" A faint smile appeared on Jonathan's face. "Still." She nodded and wrote it down. "Have you decided on dinner?" "Not yet." Emily closed her order book. Take your time. She turned to leave. Then Jonathan spoke. Emily. She paused. Yes. Jonathan carefully chose his words. I owe you an apology. Genuine surprise flickered across her face. For what? For the way I acted the other night. Emily studied him quietly. You were not rude. Jonathan almost laughed. That might be the first time anyone has described my behavior that way. People have bad days. And what if it was not a bad day? Jonathan asked. What if it was bad judgment? Emily considered the question for a moment. Then she shrugged gently. Everyone gets things wrong sometimes. Before Jonathan could respond, another table needed her attention. She excused herself and walked away. Yet the conversation lingered. Most people rushed to accept apologies from powerful men. Some tried to benefit from them. Others used them as opportunities. Emily did none of those things. She simply accepted the moment and moved on. Later that evening, Jonathan watched her help an elderly customer read a menu without making him feel embarrassed. He watched her quietly replace a meal after noticing a guest was unhappy, even before the guest complained. He watched her treat every person with the same respect, whether they arrived in designer suits or ordinary jackets. The more he observed, the more confused he became, because none of it fit the story his family records seemed to suggest. If Michael Carter had truly been connected to a hidden chapter of the Hayes family history, why had his daughter ended up here? Why was she working double shifts instead of living a life transformed by whatever secret those two keys protected? Near the end of the evening, Emily stopped beside his table one last time. Can I get you anything else? Jonathan looked up. Actually, yes. Emily waited patiently. Jonathan's eyes drifted briefly toward the silver chain hidden beneath her collar. How long have you had that key? For the first time since meeting her, Emily's calm expression changed. Not fear. Not anger. Something closer to caution. Her hand instinctively moved toward the chain beneath her sweater. A long time, she said. Quietly. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Did your father give it to you? Emily stared at him. The restaurant noise seemed to fade into the background. How do you know about my father? She asked softly. And in that moment, Jonathan realized they had both just stepped beyond a line that could never be uncrossed. Emily remained still for several seconds. Around them, conversations continued. Glasses clinked softly. A server laughed near the bar. Yet for Emily, the entire room seemed to narrow to a single question. How do you know about my father? Jonathan looked at her carefully. The confidence that usually guided every business negotiation suddenly felt useless. Because I knew him, he said quietly. Emily blinked. You knew my father? Jonathan nodded. A long time ago. Emily pulled out the empty chair across from him and sat down for the first time since their conversation began. Not because he was a billionaire. Not because she was impressed. Because she wanted answers. Most people who knew him are gone, she said. Or they only remember pieces. Jonathan glanced toward the window. The lights of Manhattan reflected against the glass like distant stars. I remember more than I should have forgotten. Emily studied his face. There was something different about him tonight. The arrogance she had witnessed during their first encounter seemed absent. In its place stood a man carrying the weight of something unresolved. Tell me, she said. Jonathan exhaled slowly. Your father worked closely with my family when I was young. Emily frowned. My father never talked much about wealthy people. That sounds like him. A faint smile crossed Jonathan's face. He rarely talked about himself either. Emily looked down briefly. No, he did not. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Then Jonathan asked the question that had haunted him for days. Did your father ever tell you what the key opens? Emily's fingers instinctively touched the chain beneath her collar. No, nothing at all. Only that I should never lose it. Jonathan nodded slowly. That is exactly what my father said about the other one. Emily's eyes widened. Other one. Jonathan immediately realized he had revealed more than intended. Emily leaned forward. There is another key? Jonathan hesitated. For years, secrecy had been part of the Hayes family culture. Yet looking at Emily, withholding the truth suddenly felt wrong. Yes, he admitted. I have it. Emily stared at him. The noise of the restaurant seemed to disappear again. You are serious. Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. After a few moments, he opened a photograph he had taken in his study. Then he slid the phone across the table. Emily looked down. Her breath caught. The silver key on the screen was nearly identical to the one she wore every day. Same design. Same engraving. Same age. She looked up slowly. That is impossible. I thought so too. Emily sat back. Her mind raced through memories. Her father repairing old locks. His mysterious stories. The occasional look in his eyes when she asked questions he never answered. Suddenly none of it felt random anymore. Why would our families have matching keys? She whispered. Jonathan shook his head. I do not know. But you are investigating. It was not a question. Jonathan almost smiled. You are observant. Comes with the job. For the first time, both laughed softly. The tension eased slightly. Then Emily's expression grew serious again. If you knew my father, why did you react the way you did the first night? Jonathan lowered his gaze. The question struck deeper than he expected. Because somewhere along the way, I became the kind of person who looks at appearances before people. Emily said nothing. Jonathan continued. When I heard your name, I realized how wrong I was. Emily studied him quietly. Most powerful people defended themselves. Jonathan was doing the opposite. Finally she spoke. My father used to say that mistakes reveal character. Jonathan looked up. How? Not when you make them. A faint smile appeared. When you admit them. The words landed harder than any criticism. Jonathan sat there in silence. And for the first time in many years, he felt less like a billionaire and more like a student sitting across from the daughter of a man who still seemed to be teaching him lessons decades later. Neither of them noticed the elderly gentleman seated near the corner booth watching their conversation with growing interest, because he had recognized the silver key around Emily's neck. And unlike either of them, he knew exactly what it opened. The elderly gentleman waited until Emily stood to return to her section before rising from his corner booth. He moved slowly, supported by a polished wooden cane, yet there was something dignified about him that made people instinctively step aside. His gray suit was old-fashioned but impeccably maintained. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his eyes remained fixed on the chain around Emily's neck. Jonathan noticed him first. The man approached their table and offered a polite nod. Excuse me, he said. I could not help overhearing part of your conversation. Emily looked slightly embarrassed. I am sorry if we were disturbing you. Not at all. The man smiled gently. My name is Charles Whitmore. Jonathan immediately recognized the name. Charles Whitmore had once served on the board of Hayes Global Holdings before retiring nearly a decade earlier. Mr. Whitmore, Jonathan said, standing. I did not know you were in the city. I visit occasionally. Charles's gaze shifted toward Emily. And tonight I believe I found a reason. Emily exchanged a confused glance with Jonathan. Charles pointed carefully toward the chain beneath her collar. May I ask where you got that key? Emily hesitated. Something about the question felt different coming from him. Less curious. More certain. My father gave it to me. Charles nodded slowly as though confirming something he had suspected for years. Michael Carter. Emily's eyes widened. You knew him too? Very well. Charles's voice softened. Better than most people did. Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Then you know what the keys open. Charles looked at both of them. For several moments he said nothing. Then he slowly lowered himself into the empty chair beside the table. I know enough. Emily sat back down. Her heart was beating faster now. For years the key had been little more than a mystery attached to family memories. Suddenly, it felt like the center of something much larger. Charles folded his hands. 30 years ago, your grandfather created something that very few people knew existed. Jonathan frowned. What are you talking about? A private archive. Jonathan stared at him. An archive? Charles nodded. Not money. Not investments. Not property. He glanced toward Emily. Truth. Neither of them spoke. Charles continued. Your grandfather believed that power could be dangerous when people forgot where it came from. So he kept records, documents, letters, agreements, personal accounts, evidence of decisions that shaped entire companies and families. Jonathan listened carefully. And the keys? The archive could only be opened by 2 matching keys. Charles smiled faintly. One held by the Hayes family. One entrusted to someone your grandfather trusted completely. Emily already knew the answer before he said it. My father. Charles nodded. Michael Carter. Silence settled over the table. Emily struggled to process what she was hearing. Her father had spent his life working ordinary jobs, fixing things, helping neighbors, volunteering at schools. Nothing about him suggested he had once been trusted with a responsibility like this. Why him? She asked quietly. Charles's expression warmed. Because he was the most honest man your grandfather ever met. The words landed heavily. Jonathan looked down. Every new piece of information seemed to elevate Michael Carter's legacy while exposing the flaws in his own assumptions. Charles continued, "Your grandfather used to say that money reveals character. Michael never changed no matter what room he walked into." Emily smiled softly. That sounded exactly like her father. Then Charles's expression grew serious. "But there is something else you should know." Jonathan immediately recognized the change in tone. "What?" Charles looked directly at him. "Your family spent years believing Michael betrayed them." Emily's smile vanished. Jonathan froze. "What are you talking about?" Charles sighed. "Because someone wanted them to believe it." The restaurant suddenly felt quieter. Emily felt a chill run through her chest. "My father never betrayed anyone." Charles met her eyes. "I know." Jonathan leaned forward. "Then who did?" Charles glanced around the room before lowering his voice. "Someone who is still very powerful." Neither Emily nor Jonathan spoke. Charles reached inside his jacket and carefully removed an old folded envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. He placed it on the table between them. "Michael gave this to me 24 years ago." Emily stared at it. Jonathan did the same. "What is it?" Charles's eyes settled on the envelope. "The reason your father spent the rest of his life carrying a burden that never belonged to him." And for the first time since this mystery began, Emily realized the secret hidden behind the keys might not only change Jonathan Hayes's life. It might completely rewrite her father's story. Emily stared at the envelope as though it might disappear if she looked away. The paper was worn at the edges, carrying the weight of years spent hidden from the world. Charles Whitmore rested one hand gently on top of it. "Your father asked me to keep this safe until the right time arrived," he said quietly. "I never expected that time would come here." Jonathan could not take his eyes off the envelope either. Every answer they uncovered seemed to reveal an even larger question. "Why did he not give it directly to my family?" he asked. Charles released a slow breath. "Because by then your family no longer trusted him." The words hung heavily between them. Emily felt a sharp ache in her chest. Her father had rarely spoken about disappointments. He never complained about unfairness. Yet hearing that he had been wrongly judged stirred something painful inside her. Charles carefully opened the envelope and removed several folded pages. The handwriting was immediately recognizable to Emily. She had seen it countless times in old birthday cards, handwritten notes, and recipe cards tucked into kitchen drawers. "That is his writing," she whispered. Charles nodded. "Read it." Emily accepted the first page with trembling fingers. The restaurant around them seemed to disappear. She began reading silently. The letter was addressed to Charles. Michael Carter explained that he feared certain truths would eventually be buried beneath assumptions, rumors, and the ambitions of powerful people. He wrote that loyalty often looked suspicious when viewed through the lens of greed. He wrote that protecting something valuable sometimes required accepting blame that belonged elsewhere. Jonathan watched Emily's expression change as she read. Confusion, surprise, then disbelief. Finally, she handed the letter to him. Jonathan scanned the page. Halfway through, his breathing slowed. Near the bottom, one sentence seemed to pull all the air from the room. "If this letter is being read, then the person who betrayed the trust of the Hayes family was never me." Jonathan read the sentence twice, then 3 times. Charles leaned forward. "Your grandfather discovered irregularities shortly before his death. Financial records, missing documents, altered agreements. Someone close to him was manipulating information." Jonathan looked up sharply. "Who?" Charles shook his head. "He never obtained proof." Emily listened carefully. "My father knew. Your father discovered enough to become dangerous to the wrong people." Charles spoke calmly, but every word carried weight. Instead of exposing suspicions without evidence, he chose to protect the archive until the truth could be verified. Jonathan lowered his eyes to the letter again. Another line stood out. "The keys must remain separate until someone worthy of both trust and truth brings them together." Emily swallowed hard. Her father had never mentioned any of this. Not once. He had carried the burden alone. The realization made her admire him even more. Not because he had guarded a secret, because he had done so without bitterness. Charles pointed toward the letter. "Keep reading." Jonathan continued. The final page contained a date, an address, and a handwritten note that immediately caught Charles's attention. "There," the older man said quietly. Emily and Jonathan looked closer. The note referenced a safety deposit vault that had never been recovered. Jonathan's pulse quickened. You think the archive is there? Charles nodded slowly. I think your grandfather expected someone would eventually find both keys. Emily touched the silver chain beneath her collar. For years she had viewed it as a connection to her father. Now it felt like something more. A responsibility passed from one generation to the next. Jonathan folded the letter carefully. His thoughts raced. Somewhere in New York, hidden behind decades of silence, might be the archive his grandfather created. Somewhere might be proof of what really happened. And somewhere might be the name of the person who allowed Michael Carter to carry suspicion he never deserved. Charles rose from his chair and adjusted his jacket. The address is still active, he said. I checked last year. Jonathan looked up. You knew? I hoped I would never need to tell this story. Charles smiled sadly. But some truths wait patiently until the right people arrive. Emily and Jonathan exchanged a glance. For the first time since meeting, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of a mystery. They were standing on the same side of it. And waiting at the end of that path was a vault, 2 matching keys, and a truth powerful enough to change everything they believed about the past. The following afternoon, a cold winter sun hung above Manhattan as Jonathan Hayes and Emily Carter stood together outside a private bank that had occupied the same stone building for more than 70 years. The address from Michael Carter's letter had led them there. Charles Whitmore accompanied them, moving carefully but with surprising determination. Inside, the bank manager greeted Jonathan immediately, but it was Emily who held everyone's attention. Not because of wealth, not because of status, because she carried one half of a mystery that had survived decades. After several security procedures, they were escorted into a quiet vault room deep beneath the building. Rows of deposit boxes lined the walls. The manager stopped before a large steel compartment unlike the others. 2 keyholes sat side by side. Jonathan stared at them. Emily did the same. Without speaking, they each removed their keys. For a moment, neither moved. Jonathan glanced toward Emily. Ready? Emily looked down at the key her father had entrusted to her so many years ago. I think my father spent a lifetime waiting for this moment. Together, they inserted the keys. A soft metallic click echoed through the room. Then another. The lock released. The manager stepped back respectfully as the compartment opened. Inside sat a single leather case. No stacks of money. No hidden fortune. No priceless jewels. Just a worn leather case carrying the weight of 30 years. Emily carefully lifted it onto the table. Her hands trembled slightly. Jonathan opened the lid. Inside were journals, letters, financial records, photographs, and handwritten statements organized with extraordinary precision. For hours they reviewed document after document. Slowly, the truth emerged. Jonathan's grandfather had been correct. Someone close to the family had manipulated records, redirected investments, and concealed critical information. The evidence was undeniable. More importantly, every page confirmed the same thing. Michael Carter had spent years protecting the Hayes family from a betrayal he could not fully prove. Rather than accuse someone without evidence, he preserved the records and safeguarded the archive until the truth could one day speak for itself. Emily sat quietly as tears gathered in her eyes. Not tears of sadness. Relief. Her father had never received recognition during his lifetime. Yet here, in black ink across dozens of pages, was proof of the man she had always known him to be. Honest, loyal, courageous. Jonathan closed one of the journals and lowered his head. Shame settled heavily in his chest. For years, his family had allowed suspicion to surround Michael Carter's name. For years, they had accepted an incomplete story because it was easier than searching for the truth. Emily noticed his expression. My father would not want you blaming yourself. Jonathan looked up. How can you know that? A gentle smile appeared on her face. Because he spent his whole life teaching people to move forward instead of backward. Charles Whitmore nodded. That sounds exactly like Michael. Several weeks later, Jonathan organized a formal event at Hayes Global Holdings. Executives, board members, journalists, and community leaders filled the auditorium. Many expected a major business announcement. Instead, Jonathan stepped to the podium and told a different story. He spoke about integrity, about assumptions, about the danger of judging people by appearances. Then he publicly revealed the truth about Michael Carter and presented the evidence preserved within the archive. The room fell silent. At the front row, Emily sat quietly, uncomfortable with attention but determined to honor her father's memory. Jonathan then announced the creation of the Michael Carter Foundation, dedicated to literacy programs, trade education, and community mentorship. Everything Michael had believed in. Applause filled the room. Yet the moment that mattered most came afterward. Jonathan stepped away from the podium and walked directly toward Emily. In front of everyone, he extended his hand. "The first time I saw you, I looked at your uniform instead of your character." His voice remained steady. "That was my mistake." Emily accepted his hand. "And now," Jonathan smiled, "now I see what your father spent his life building." The audience rose to its feet, but Emily's thoughts drifted elsewhere. She imagined her father sitting quietly in the back of the room, embarrassed by the attention, probably wishing everyone would focus on helping people instead of celebrating him. The thought made her laugh softly. Months later, the silver keys were displayed together inside a small glass case at the foundation headquarters. Not as symbols of wealth, as symbols of trust. Visitors often asked why two ordinary keys were treated with such care. A plaque beneath them provided the answer. It read, "Truth needs protection. Character needs no advertisement." And sometimes the people we overlook are the very people holding the keys to everything that matters.